What if meaningful work isn't just about what we do, but about how we grow while we're doing it? I'm Andrew Soren, and today on Meaningful Work Matters, I'm joined by Latika Nirula, Director of the Center for Faculty Development at University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicine. In this episode, we explore how professional development can become a deeply human and transformative experience, grounded in reflection, connection, and courageous self-inquiry. Latika shares how storytelling, vulnerability, and values-based growth can help educators and leaders reconnect with their purpose, and how institutions can truly support both competence and compassion. Join us for a conversation that reimagines growth as a liberating, meaningful, and relational practice. Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Latika, it is wonderful to be able to have you on Meaningful Work Matters. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
I think that this is probably going to be a slightly different kind of episode than we often have on this program because, your main focus isn't necessarily meaning and purpose research, but you are somebody who has to figure out how to apply meaning and purpose in all the work that you do in a lot of ways. So this is going to be a real practitioner-focused perspective, especially as an educator.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, maybe with that as a bit of a backdrop, I can just ask you to introduce yourself however you'd like to be introduced to our audience, and also just to share a little bit about what makes your work meaningful.
I'm the director of the Center for Faculty Development, which is, I'll say, definitely a practitioner, teacher-focused center for health professionals at the University of Toronto. What we do is we support health professionals who are trying to build their capacity as educators in their various roles, thinking about what that looks like in healthcare spaces and how they supervise and support learners. In terms of my own professional background, I'll say I'm a teacher at heart myself. I used to be a high school teacher and then moved into higher ed. I'm an educational psychologist. And I've really thought a lot about this kind of notion of teacher identity, expertise, and faculty development really across my career. Is truly, I would say, guided my past as well as my current research. And these days, I would say I've been thinking a lot about teacher identity in the context of teacher performance and how we can use data to get better and what role faculty development programs can play in supporting excellence in teaching.
In the context of the work that you do, many of the healthcare professionals that you're working with identify themselves in different kinds of ways. So tell me a little bit about what you notice and even what you mean by identity in that context.
Yeah, so maybe I should also acknowledge that I struggle with the notion of identity myself personally.
Mm.
Um, and often feeling sometimes like an outsider coming into healthcare spaces. As I shared, I used to be a high school teacher. As I said, I'm a researcher by background, educational psychologist, but I'm not a clinician. And my work inherently involves me connecting with clinical teachers and helping to cultivate their identity as teachers. And so this idea of sometimes feeling like an outsider or feeling maybe a dissonance around that role identity is something that I can greatly empathize with. Um, and I used to feel really insecure about my non-clinical identity. Maybe there's a bit of that imposter syndrome that kicks in that. But now I see it as a bit of a superpower. It gives me an opportunity to really empathize with clinical teachers that I support in my coaching work who really, I would say their identity has been largely shaped by being healthcare providers or working within the healthcare system. I think you talk about this theme in some of your other podcasts, which is around this kind of idea of healthcare being a calling. And so for many of these folks, that's kind of their primary identity. They really resonate with the notion of being a clinician, whether it be, a doctor, a nurse, or a pharmacist, whatever that role may be, as being kind of their true identity. And so, this can be kind of thought about in a sort of layered identity kind of way around, is there space to have multiple callings across your career or lifespan? And what does that look like as you try to reconcile and bring these identities together? So that's something that I've been thinking quite a bit about as I do a lot of my coaching work, because I see that as an emerging tension as people try to hold multiple identities in this space.
It is really interesting, and you're right, there's been a whole bunch of episodes on this podcast that have gotten into various elements of this category of identity, and especially calling, especially when meaning becomes really, really important to what one's identity is. Some of the people who've been on this podcast, like Jeff Thompson, have specifically studied doctors and looked at,
Yes.
that kind of clinician from that perspective. We've had nurses like Donna Gaffney, who've looked at it. We've also had, personality psychologists like Reb Rebely, who think about the multitudes of identities that might be within us. And I think all of that's super interesting, but I think that this idea of conflicts between different identities or overlapping identities is really, really interesting. And I'm curious how you see that play out amongst the populations that you work with.
I definitely think that it's something that we have to kind of grapple with through faculty development work in particular. I think it's a huge part of what makes faculty development different from other forms of professional development
Mhm.
that clinical educators may go through over the course of their career. Because it's really focused around cultivating the teacher identity in a really kind of notable way, I would say. So a lot of what we do is to try to draw that out. I would kind of argue and maybe share that a lot of what's rooted in what supports this sort of idea of clinical identity formation and specifically teacher clinical identity formation is thinking about how we surface the vulnerability of what that identity holds for folks. People may often feel very competent as a clinician. And yet you throw them into a situation where now you have to supervise learners and now we expect you to be a competent teacher. And so what does that look like in the context of the work that you do? We think a lot about, supporting that reconciling of that, I'll say that dissonance that comes with that identity formation. Maybe I can share like a concrete example
Yeah,
of something
please.
that with a physician that I've kind of been doing some coaching work with, where I was just really struck with her sharing with me this kind of statement of like, I teach all the time, but I don't feel like a teacher. And I would say that that dissonance is very common, right? And so with her, we explored, that teaching is happening in her world, and quite a bit, but yet she didn't seem to hold that identity. In fact, I would even say that she felt, I would say, using sort of the literature and words of
Mhm.
like, of researchers like Levin Wenger, who do a lot of work around, communities of practice, which we say is one thing that we try to cultivate a lot of within faculty development. She didn't really see that though as being part of a community in the work that she does as teachers. And so that was really curious to me as I do a lot of this faculty development work. I saw this kind of shift happen, even though she wasn't able to sort of name it this way. She was mentoring residents, she was engaging in case discussions. There was a lot of nuance to how she was bringing clinical practice to the forefront for her learners. She was giving feedback, she was role modeling professional values. And I would say that these were all things about living your teacher identity. And yet that wasn't something that she readily accepted or kind of would recognize as being part of her. And so over time, really through a process of reflection and support, which I'd say we do through faculty development activities, she really began to shift how she saw herself. She started to feel more confident in her interactions with learners. And what was really interesting is she started to even give back to
Hmm.
her community. I started to notice that she was like getting more involved, and I could do a session for my other colleagues around this topic because it was so helpful to me. And again, these are all identities and all activities that I would say are so core to like what it means to be an excellent clinical teacher. And so for me, this is like a little bit of the power of what faculty development can bring. It's just not just about the knowledge and skills. It's about, thinking about creating spaces where people can see themselves differently, where they can recognize and claim an identity that might have just even been below the surface of it. But really, it's about rediscovering your meaning and purpose in your work.
Mhm.
And I think that's a lot of what you talk about, Andrew, in your podcast. It's about that sort of flourishing through connection, thinking about reflection, and really deepening a sense of who you are and what is possible.
Mm.
And so I thought that with this example, that would really kind of came to the fore for me
Yeah,
as I'm.
it's a great example. Thank you so much for bringing it. It makes it so clear as to what some of those overlapping, I won't necessarily say competing, but I think that they are probably competing identities might be. It makes me reflect again on another episode, but a conversation with Michael Pratt, who talks about pathways to meaning, that we have all of these different ways in his research. He's kind of classified 6 different ways in which we generally find meaning in our work, and some of those are very utilitarian. We work to live, and the paycheck is really important. Or sometimes it's about status and climbing a ladder, but sometimes it's about passion, and sometimes it's about service, and sometimes it's about mastery, and sometimes it's about kinship. And um, this idea that specifically the people that you often are working with are real masters in what they do. And in fact, they've probably spent a whole bunch of their lives becoming subject matter experts in what they do.
Yeah.
And now they're moving into this other territory that might be more about being an educator or serving a very different population, not serving a client, but or a patient, but having to serve, a student, is such a different kind of mindset, and not where they naturally go. And well, you talked about it before, this sense of imposter syndrome, and I think I feel
Cool.
that too. I think in some ways, for those of us who have spent our lives becoming subject matter experts in something, having to shift those roles and think about our identity in a different way, or even sometimes for me, I know, a big barrier is I think that everybody knows the things that I know. I fail to see myself as an educator in many different contexts around things like well-being or meaning or purpose, because my assumption is that everyone just kind of knows these things. So I'm curious. Maybe we can kind of dive a little bit more into this idea of like imposter syndrome and what we do about it.
Yeah, I think that's really real. And can I self-declare that I feel it often too in the spaces that I'm in? As I've shared, there's often this sense of feeling an outsider and not necessarily having the confidence and expertise in a particular domain. And I think that's what really we try to cultivate in around a sense of creating lifelong learning and a passion for lifelong learning, that we're all not necessarily ever an end point or a finish point, and it's always an evolution. And so really kind of challenging this notion of expertise as a finish line and actually part of a journey that you're on. And I think that that's kind of really key to this kind of overcoming perhaps this notion of imposter syndrome in domains that maybe we feel like we're still developing. It inherently requires vulnerability. And I think that's hard for those working in healthcare spaces who are often put forward and also societal expectations that you are the expert in this area. And we're seeing this being challenged in some ways through disruptive technology and AI as we think about, who is the expert, right? And so I think it is a little bit about getting grounded in who you are and being vulnerable and open to what you don't know. And that also is a strength, that vulnerability of being able to talk about what we don't know, and not let that be the springboard for growth and evolution. So yeah, I it resonates with me. I see it in the coaching practice that I do. It shows up very much in some of the learning spaces that we create. And part of our role as faculty developers is to really help to create, I'll say, some psychological safety and openness to be able for people to go there with us, right? And to normalize that feeling, for folks.
Something that you just said is like a neon light kind of shining in this conversation, for me, around artificial intelligence and generative AI, and And this question of vulnerability around expertise, I think it's actually a really, really profound question as we think about the future of work, of the ways in which, the, AI is kind of so much more capable than I ever will be at being able to know everything. And so understanding where does my expertise fit in that context feels like something that from a meaningful work perspective is a massive thing for us to try to figure out for the sake of anybody who at least thought, oh, I do kind of white collar creative work. AI will never be able to do that kind of work. That's just about machines and robots. But
Yeah.
no.
It is an interesting question to ponder, and it has been quite a disruptive force as we think about health professions, education, and as I said, the notion of what expertise is. Increasingly, we're building in medical education programs and health profession programs the notion of adaptive expertise
Mm,
and using that as a helpful frame. And it definitely has influenced how we've approached our faculty development programming. So it's less about the knowledge and skills, it's less about information, and it's more about thinking about adaptation, growth, and evolution. And this idea that you need to be able to adapt to your context. You need to kind of think in those sort of more critical skills kind of spaces. And it's less about what you know and what you need, maybe what you need to know, and how do you make decisions and judgments based on that. So it's how you bring a critically reflexive lens to your interactions with learners
mm,
and kind of, again, sit in that sort of space of we often talk about it in terms of psychology, the zone of proximal development and how that's really key, that it's okay to feel discomfort in the learning process. In fact, that is critical to your growth as in whatever domain it is that you're seeking expertise in. But yeah, I really anchor around that idea of adaptive expertise and increasingly our need to have programming that focuses on that as opposed to like a set list of competencies and knowledge items and facts that you need to know.
mm. Um, Beautiful. Thank you. So helpful. That is so incredibly helpful. Beyond AI, there's all sorts of other headwinds that are certainly hitting healthcare these days. We're both in Canada, and wow, our healthcare systems, no matter where we are in this country, are strained. There's so many complex patient needs. There's evolving learner expectations. There's just it's. I would
Mm.
imagine being a healthcare educator in this moment in time, certainly in this context, is hard, and I would imagine that there's a lot of people who are burning out. And so I'm curious, what like is that true? What are you seeing? Like,
Yeah,
what's going on?
absolutely. So, I mean, thinking about clinical teachers or healthcare professionals, I mean, the risk of burnout in our current climate is very real. We see clinicians being asked to see more patients, to integrate AI technologies in their work, to think about taking on more learners. So, especially within the Canadian context, we've increased the number of spots for trainees, and there's a pressure to expand our capacity to build up that next generation who to actually support the strained healthcare system we find ourselves in. And you wrap all of that up into the fact that we also have lives outside of our healthcare roles. And so how do we find space for that? So yes, it's very real. I mean, I work a lot with physicians, other healthcare providers as well. And, I'm thinking about some recent conversations I had with a physician who really felt quite overwhelmed about the increased pressure from the institution to take on more learners. And she still was in sort of beginning stages of learning to build her skills as a clinical teacher. And so this just it's kind of that layer, like one thing on top of the other. And can I keep up with it and still feel like I can adapt and build my expertise in these new domains? So I would say that there is increasing pressure from our institutions,
Mm,
and that's not always matched with adequate support. And I'll say clinical teachers really do struggle with balancing it all.
mm,
I mean, the good news is that there are some I think that, what we talked about today in terms of the power of faculty development and really honoring what that means for our clinical teachers can really be helpful. It allows you to really explore in more depth your teaching role and to see those kind of teachable moments, I'll say teaching moments that could be embedded within your clinical work. So people often see these as like two things that are separate. And I think when you are able to better integrate these identities in a way that helps to build your whole identity, that can be really helpful in maybe mitigating some of these feelings of yet another thing.
Hmm.
It is part of the full identity scope. So, for example, seeing that, when you have these clinical encounters and you have a learner in the room with you, and you're able to explain these diagnoses or help to guide these procedures, these are extensions of your clinical practice. These aren't separate things that, okay, now I'm wearing my teacher hat and I'm going to engage with the trainee in that way. And I think that can help in some ways in sort of at least the perceptions of these being added burdens. Thinking about where can you embed these moments to provide formative feedback. I mean, I hear that a lot from clinical teachers is like, where am I going to fit in the time to give
Mhm.
any meaningful feedback? And they think about feedback sessions as these big, elaborate events that need to happen instead of looking at those micro moments of human connection and possibility in what they see in their clinical practice, and that can be part of it. So I think really thinking about how you can support those in those moments. Of course, I acknowledge that this is probably easier said than done, you know.
But it's
Another thing,
so it's
yes,
so
yeah, sorry.
it's so important. I have I've been using this metaphor a number of times over the last couple of weeks, but a colleague of mine, Dove Seidman, who I used to work with, who wrote a wonderful book that was all about how we do anything is everything, and he always used to say that. Well, going back to the machine metaphors that we were just talking about before, that if you press pause on a machine, it stops. But if you press pause on a human being, it starts and it starts to rethink and to reconnect and to reflect. And
Mhm.
that those moments of pause are so critical for our capacity to be able to do any of the things that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it feels, especially when things are getting faster and when there's more demand, like it's the one thing that's absolutely impossible. Like, how on earth do I press the pause button in the course of my day? But the thing that he always said is that it's not the giant pause that's really important. It's actually pausing in stride. It's finding those micro moments. It's how do we even just take a breath here and there? It's
And I see that's the important role modeling piece for learners, that they need to see clinicians doing that because it gives them permission to do it when they become practitioners themselves.
Mhm.
It's like we've become this kind of society where we feel like we have to celebrate the burnout culture or doing more rather than actually maybe showing a different path forward. And so sometimes I see this as sort of the generational tensions that happen within our current teaching and learning climate, where faculty will say, well, learners today, they just come in whenever they want to or whatever, and that's a perception around it rather than maybe reframing that and saying, wow, maybe they're prioritizing their wellness differently. And maybe the way that I was approaching things was not necessarily the way it should have gone. And so I think really creating space to recalibrate around what it means to be a successful clinician in our current environment is such an important discussion and dialogue that we need to have with our learners.
Mhm.
It's a whole different path forward.
Um, I'd love to maybe shift the conversation and talk a little bit about something else that you mentioned before, which is the idea of communities or communities of practice. And so, maybe tell us a little bit more about how you've seen communities of practice really help shape identities, and just any best practices or things that we should be thinking about, and how anybody can bring more community into their work.
Yes, absolutely. I think that that's a critical piece that helps to cultivate that sense of identity is to be around others who have a kind of shared purpose around the work that you're hoping to strive in. And so the more and more you engage with communities of practice, you move more from the periphery into the center. And that can create a lot of meaning in the work that you do. It also brings workplaces together. So when you find your kind of kindred spirits in your environment, that can be incredibly motivating. But to expect people to find that on their own, I think is sometimes is a lofty goal. And so that's where institutions need to come in, where they honor and they value and create spaces for people who are doing similar work to find each other. And for that work and connection to be valued and part of the workday, not as an extra thing to do when you find your own time. And so that's the beauty of faculty development. It's something that we encourage all faculty to engage in. And so we take this idea of community really important in the work that we do within our programming. So we're really intentional about creating space that just goes beyond just bringing people together to talk about theory around teaching and learning. That's important to have the background to understand it's a practice, but it's about shifting and creating spaces for storytelling and I'll say opportunities for reflection and dialogue with others. And I think that's how people make meaning in their experiences. So, for example, in the coaching work that I do, I'll often ask a clinical teacher to reflect on a moment that they actually felt like they were a teacher. And it's really simple prompt, but it opens a door for rich conversation and identity exploration. And so we do that in our programs by bringing people together to have that shared dialogue on prompts like that in various ways in our programming. And it can be cultivated even in a one-time workshop where you allow people to share their experiences, how they integrate these identities in their work. What are some of the things that seem to have great resonance for them and they've experienced success? And also where they've experienced challenge, right? I think that's important to give space for that as well. And of course, sometimes that's easier to achieve in our longitudinal programs because you get people together for a more extended period of time. They build a real sense of cohesion, their cohort. But I think you can do it in so many different forms, whether it be through peer groups or mentorship or coaching. But it's that idea of creating space together. So clinicians can see that they're not navigating these education roles and identities and activities in isolation, but it really does help to cultivate that sense of shared purpose. And I think it's important to recognize that identity is inherently co-constructed. It really does emerge from social interaction, and I've talked about the work of Levin Wenger. It reminds us about that, like very much so. And I see faculty development as relational. It is a relational practice. It's not just informational. And so we need to hold space for people to be able to name their values, to hear other people's experiences, to recognize each other's contributions. And so, in that process of coming together in this way, we're really supporting people's professional growth and also their personal flourishing. These two things happen together. I mentioned about like storytelling and how that's an important piece. And I think giving space for people to share their stories, to share their narratives. There's a whole line of some research that I'm doing right now with colleagues around how we can better integrate patient and family storytelling into the educational work that we do in health professions education. That can actually be really transformative in clinical teachers' understanding of how their practice kind of influences the educational enterprise as well. So thinking about how that can be embedded in the work that they do. The more we bring learners together with patients and family partners, the people that they're serving, and create educational experiences around that, I think can really help with this identity integration that we talked about, or I think you said about layered identity we discussed before. It really is about them linking those, I'll say, multiple callings and purpose within healthcare providers.
Wow, Latika, it's amazing. my my head is spinning with all
Yeah.
of these ideas. I mean, it makes me realize that we are fundamentally, from an evolutionary psychology perspective, we are a species that sat around fire pits and told stories to one another. The notion of oral history and learning in general was all about storytelling until very, 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 very recently in our evolutionary kind of history as a species. And I think it's the power of what language is. I mean, words do create worlds, and story creates culture, and the ways in which we shape those things is so important. It is true. It's also true. I mean, it makes me think about other people who've talked about the qualitative aspects of doing research around meaning and purpose. So it's like someone like Mario Lipswiersma, whose whole work has been about asking people, what does meaningful work mean to you? What does a sense of purpose mean to you? And it's this dialogical aspect. It's just being asked that question that to a certain extent becomes the intervention in and of itself. And people might not have an automatic answer, but by spending the time and just reflecting on it for themselves, it opens up these worlds of possibility. And that's the thing that in some ways creates meaning in and of itself.
Yes, I agree with that. That's really, really powerful. I think a lot about just, yeah, how do we hold space for each other, right? To be able to tell those stories. And I mean, it's important to acknowledge the tension of busy professional lives and creating those moments where that could be possible.
Hmm.
It's definitely something I've been thinking about and how I can ground that in my own practice. To hold those moments for myself is not easy. You have to
Not
be
easy.
really deliberate about it for sure.
Yeah. So how do you do? I mean, you've talked a little bit throughout this podcast about this is very real for you. It's a little bit like
Yeah,
a fractal. I mean, the things that we teach are the things that we deal with ourselves,
yeah,
and I certainly relate to all of that. Like it is hard to walk your talk on the pause. It is hard to walk your talk on on
yeah.
the community of practice. So how like what are you noticing in your own work?
It starts with how you do that for yourself and then how you do that for your team. So, as I mentioned, I lead the Center for Faculty Development. I have a team of about 15 people who have really different backgrounds and who are quite passionate about the work of developing others. And so we have to walk the talk, as you said. It's about living our values in the truest sense, because then we give permission to others that we serve through our center to do the same for themselves. One thing that I have to say that I'm so fortunate of is to work in such a collaborative team that, leans in with a lot of curiosity and kindness and a real shared commitment to each other's growth. I'll share one practice that we have at our center, which, is probably one of the things I'm the most proud of. Even though we talk a lot about what we achieve, these aren't things that necessarily people see us doing, but it has fundamentally shaped the way we work with one another. So every quarter, we have something we call critical conversations, where we invite a member of the team to bring forward a topic that they're personally pursuing in terms of just thinking about. And it could be on a personal level, it could be on a work level, but these are kind of big topics that might be so, for example, thinking about how we integrate equity and diversity into our work, or thinking about land acknowledgements and making those non-tokenistic and really meaningful. These are some of the types of topics that we might explore in these critical conversations. And they're team led, like an individual will lead and facilitate the conversation. We block time for it during paid work time. The time also to review resources related to the topic and discussion is part of the paid work time. So you might get a calendar block for an hour or 2 hours in your calendar. The first hour would be to review resources, podcasts like your own, or other kinds of resources. So they could be quite dynamic. They're not always just like published literature. And the individual will give a suggestion of what they want the team to kind of review. And then we come together for an hour, and it's pretty open-ended. The only thing that we kind of say to people is you show up with curiosity, kindness, and a commitment to each other's growth. And that's the goal of it. It doesn't mean about finding answers. And it's that idea of openness to what we don't know, right? Again, that kind of challenging that notion of expertise that we've already been talking about today. And so for me, I just love these conversations. They have challenged what I know. I've been exposed to things that I hadn't read, ideas that have made me really shift my thinking in important and powerful ways. And you just get to witness other people's creativity and their own thinking and their own passion for the work. So that makes me humble. It makes me energized. And it's really not about just like the achievements that we have that are sort of visible, or that we report on as a center, but it's really about how we grow together. So I see this as really like a gift, to be part of a workplace community that really honors that.
That is a gift. Oh my God. I love that idea. What a brilliant best practice. I'm kind of curious when you first introduced it, what was the reaction for people? Or even how did it come to be in the first place? Like I'm thinking about this mostly because I would imagine that some people are thinking like, I love this idea, but I'm not exactly sure how I would implement that within my team. So what would you say to introduce something like that?
It's what you start before that enables that. For us, it's been really more of a conversation around grounding ourselves in our values. And that showing up in other ways and other micro moments before you introduce an initiative like this. it really was born out of people having curiosity about topics and knowing as leaders, like I have a, associate director that I work with who is really quite instrumental in leading this initiative with the staff. And so it was really with us saying that we're not going to be the first to facilitate this. This is going to be team driven. We found someone who was in the team who was naturally curious and wanted to create space of this learning for themselves and said, how if we do this together?
Sure.
But it was about like unifying around that sense of shared purpose and values that sets the foundation for this type of conversation. Because when you come into it, you know already you're going to be in a vulnerable space. And so you need to feel like you can share and that you're not going to be perceived by your colleagues like, I can't believe, she doesn't even know anything about this topic. Like you have to kind of have a culture where that kind of sentiment wouldn't be as supportive. And so that it involves a lot of trust building. So we've done a lot of team building activities that kind of set, I would say, the foundation for this to be part of it. And then you kind of role model the culture of it in each conversation. So there's a lot of opportunity for appreciation and acknowledgement of people's vulnerability in these spaces. And then you as a leader need to show up with a similar vulnerable stance as well. I often will share very openly, like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing that. And I also am open to the critique in the moment. If I've said something in a way that, maybe might have been misconstrued or maybe might have not been the most sensitive, to be open to receiving that feedback from the team. Um, Maybe for them to call me in. I will say not call me out, but call me in and point that out to me so that I can, continue to foster this sort of culture that we have within our community and our group. So yeah, it is about building the trust and taking those steps towards it. But yeah, and then it kind of pays forward, right? Once people see others taking these risks and these chances, it creates more space to have these continued dialogues. So I think the team really values these. We made them optional, so you don't have to attend. But I would say it's a rare occurrence that we don't have the entire team there. Everyone really sees these as meaningful moments within the busyness of our work because it is a pause that is structured in. Like, as I said, this is happening during paid work time. It is blocked in people's calendars. So they are given permission to tune out the other parts of their jobs and really see this as essential to the work that we do. This is part of the work. And I think that kind of acknowledgement of that really helps to set that foundation.
Wow. Latika, when I first asked if you would come onto this podcast talking about calling in, not calling out, but you were you were hesitant. You were like, I don't know whether I have anything to contribute around
It's
this
the
particular
imposter
topic.
syndrome. It keeps creeping in.
But wow, this was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I'm leaving with so many just interesting ideas that are popping through my head, these neon moments, these fantastic practices. I'm so grateful for the fact that you chose to come on here today. Do you think that there's anything that I should have asked you about meaningful work that I haven't today?
Think we had a really robust conversation. Maybe I'll just leave on the note around and maybe underscore something that I did share is around thinking about um, the work that we do within sort of, I'll say, clinical education teaching as being deeply relational. It's not about just acquiring those sets of skills, tools, knowledge, attitude that we often will like talk about those learning objectives. Those are important, but it's around how we come together, that relational work. And there's really, I say inherently with that, a shared sense of reciprocity and trust that needs to be fostered. So, whether it's what I described in that kind of work that I do with my team or what we try to create through coaching or programming, it is really creating space and seeing that and honoring that as part of the work.
Well, if any of our listeners do want to get in touch with you and provide their insights, is there any place that you want to direct them?
Yeah. So if you want to learn more about our center and my contact information and some of our programming is there as well. It's the centerforfacdev.ca is our website. I will share some details also with Andrew that he can include in the show notes and hopefully send you on more of a journey to explore the whole world of identity and how that kind of plays into our meaning and work. So grateful, Andrew, for the opportunity to talk to you today and to engage around this topic.
Thank you, Latika. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.